So Father Brad Baker will be speaking tonight on the importance of friendship to Catholic men. In these chaotic times, we need other men who are friends and allies in our quest to lead our families to heaven. Men must be leaders in this effort, as it is risky to outsource this task to others when we're dealing with a culture that is hostile to our faith. I think that the situation at Bennett Academy this week reinforces that idea. Father Brad grew up in Joliet. His late parents, Babe and Dick Baker, had 4 boys. Father Brad is the third of their 4 sons. He is a graduate of Joliet Catholic and Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa. He worked in event marketing and promotions throughout his 20s and entered the University of St. Mary of the Lake, Mundelein Seminary, at the age of 30. At age 35, he was ordained to the priesthood and assigned to Immaculate Conception Parish in Elmhurst, where he served as parochial vicar for 5 years. Father Brad spent the next 13 years at the Cathedral of St. Raymond in Joliet, where he served briefly as parochial vicar, then administrator, and then rector. In 2018, Father Brad is appointed as the pastor of Saints Peter and Paul. Let us give a warm welcome to Father Brad.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to be with you this evening, so thank you for the invitation. This is my commandment. Love one another as I love you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. This I command you. Love one another. In the Gospels, close spiritual connections are described as familial in general and fraternal in particular. Jesus tells his followers, "For whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." Elsewhere we read, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, was one of the 2 who heard John and followed Jesus. He first found his own brother Simon and told him, "We have found the Messiah." Then he brought him to Jesus. This harmony between siblings thus becomes the key element in finding peace with God. You are my friends if you do what I command you. For whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. As Catholic men, we have 2 goals: heaven for ourselves and for our families, and to do what we can for as long as we can to make this world better. In addition, these are not simply goals like some sort of 5-year plan. These are what we are called to by our Catholic faith and the universal call to holiness. We are called to be saints. A number of years ago, and I apologize if some of you have heard this story from me before, I'm fond of telling it, I was celebrating baptisms at the cathedral, and that day there were 10 children being baptized, which was a handful. And as you begin the rite for baptism, deacons or priests, we walk among the families and you ask the parents what name they've given their child and what it is they ask of God's church for their child. And of course, the natural answer is baptism. Baptism. Especially for parents that have been through it before. They know that's the obvious answer. But sometimes you hear different answers. I want my child to grow up with values. I want my child to grow up in a community of faith. But that day, in the cathedral when I was baptizing 10 children, I heard an answer from a parent that I'd never heard before and I've never heard since. And I've been a priest for 21 years. This mother, she and her husband had brought 2 children with her that day to be baptized. And she looked at me and she said, "I want my children to become saints. I want my children to become saints." I tell that story at baptisms, and of course the eyes of the other parents get really large when you say that, because you're not expecting that answer. And it also sets the bar really high, doesn't it? I mean, I want my children to become saints, you know? There's accountability associated with that. You've named it. You've named what your desire is for your children. And I think that's healthy, because if we've got goals, if we've got aspirations, there's often a plan that accompanies it. We are all called to be saints. We have all been created to be saints. God's desire for each of us is that we live with Him forever in heaven. We know that from John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, Jesus says, "Everything that the Father gives me will come to me, and I will not reject anyone who comes to me, because I came down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of the one who sent me. And the will of the one who sent me is that I should not lose anything of what He gave me, but that I should raise it on the last day. For this is the will of my Father, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in Him may have eternal life, and I shall raise him on the last day." Jesus could not be more transparent, more clear about what God's desire is for His children. It is that all of us believe in what His Son's done for us, and that we live with Him forever in heaven. My nephew, Brian, just started his freshman year at the University of Dayton. Brian and I are very close. My younger brother lost his wife 4 years ago at the age of 50 to stomach cancer. And I'm very close to Brian and his younger sister, Brianna. And each day I pray that Brian and my other godchildren, Nick and Johnny, make good choices, that they make good decisions. I also pray that they have good friends who support them in making good choices and good decisions. And with Brian beginning college, I added to my prayers that Brian make good friends at Dayton. I was so pleased to learn that first week, he let me know it, that he had gone to Mass, and that he enjoyed the experience of Mass at Dayton. He enjoyed the music and the community. They have 5 Masses there on a Sunday, so I'm really grateful for that. But when you're away from home, right, you can make different decisions. And the following week, Brian sent me a photo of him at Mass, but this time with 2 friends that had accompanied him, 2 new friends, Anthony and Jacob. And the following weekend was Labor Day weekend, and one of Brian's best friends lost his dad suddenly. His dad and his wife Jamie had just dropped him off at Mizzou 5 days earlier, and he died of a heart attack. So the funeral was a Saturday of Labor Day weekend, which I celebrated. And Brian had come home for the funeral. And one of these new friends, Jacob, rode home with Brian. He lives in Davenport, Iowa, but at least he got to Joliet, and then his mom picked him up there and took him on to Davenport. Well, that Monday, Labor Day, I met Jacob. And he told me that his brother is studying theology at Benedictine University in Kansas, and that he's thinking about going into the seminary. And I'm just thinking, good character, you know? I mean, my brothers and my nephew's swimming in a good pool. So our parents, in one way or another, instilled in us the understanding that you will be judged by the company you keep, right? Good friends. Good friends that encourage you only to make good choices. It's critically important in our efforts to be who God created us to be. Ultimately, the saints that God desires us to be. The authors of sacred scripture always understood that we need one another to grow in godliness. As men, we desire the companionship of fellow men after our own hearts. As the noted author and Christian professor C.S. Lewis wrote in The Four Loves, friendship may not be a biological necessity for survival, But as long as men have walked the earth, we men have known we need to do things together. And we only need to look to Jesus to recognize that. Even Jesus, right, had Peter, James, and John, his own inner circle of male friends. We need male friends right now who know us, who listen to us. We need spiritual friends who understand us, who will encourage us and counsel us. Friends who will help us carry our burdens. We need friends who value us for who we are, not what we have accomplished. We need friends who will point us to Christ, as Andrew did for Simon. We need friends who care about the way we are becoming or not becoming like Christ. We need friends who are helping us to be the people God created us to be. We read in the 4th chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes, 2 are better than 1. If the one falls, the other will help the fallen one. And in the 18th chapter of Proverbs, there are friends who bring ruin, but there are true friends more loyal than a brother. We also, as you can well know, need good friends to call us out on our poor behavior and choices. A number of years ago, I read the book, The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch. Pausch was, I'm sure some of you read the book, it was a bestseller. Pausch was a computer science professor at Carnegie Mellon University, and he was diagnosed with a terminal cancer. And so professors in the field of academics have a tradition of offering the last lecture. And so this was going to be his last lecture, and the lecture hall was packed. The lecture wasn't about dying, but rather it was about living. It was about the importance of overcoming obstacles, of enabling the dreams of others, of seizing every moment because time is all you have. And you may one day find that you have less than you think. Pausch said he really gave the lecture for his young children, not the students gathered that day. They were all served by it, but he really gave it for his children. The lasting lessons he wanted them to learn from their father. And this quote is from Randy Pausch's book. When you're screwing up and nobody says anything to you anymore, that means they've given up on you. That lesson has stuck with me my whole life. When you see yourself doing something badly and nobody's bothering to tell you anymore, that's a bad place to be. You may not want to hear it, but your critics are often the ones telling you they still love you, they still care about you, and they want to make you better. That's what good friends do. By calling you out on your behavior, they are communicating their love and their care for you and their desire that they want to help you be better. Iron is sharpened by iron. One person sharpens another. We read that in Proverbs. I want to tell a very personal story with you. It's about my cousin Dave. As it was mentioned before I began speaking, I was one of 4 boys. But my parents, they had kind of 2 families. They had one son and then another son 1 year and 2 years after they were married, and then it was 8 years before I was born, and then 3 years before my younger brother was born. So we were kind of raised like 2 families. They went to Catholic grade school and public high school. We went to public grade school, Catholic high school. They did scouts, we did Indian guides. My parents were tweaking things as they went. But because of the age gap between my older brothers and myself, I'm much closer to my younger brother. There was just a gap there, a generational gap. So I had 2 cousins in Des Moines, Iowa, Dave and Marty Baker. And our family, my dad's from Iowa, we would always go back to Iowa for Thanksgiving and see my grandmother and my cousins, my aunt and uncle. And Dave was 3 years older than me, so he was right in that sweet spot. And everything Dave did, had an impact on me. His bedroom was painted lime green, so I begged my parents to paint my bedroom lime green. He had glow-in-the-dark stars on his ceiling, so I asked for glow-in-the-dark stars on my ceiling. He was a paper boy, so I became a paper boy. It just was that imprinting. I really admired Dave and looked up to Dave. And the age difference wasn't so significant, but yet it was significant enough for me to look up to him. And then, of course, you get older, and that gap isn't there anymore. And I remember I was a student at Loras, and he and his wife met at the University of Iowa, and he was working for the Carnation Company in Waterloo, Iowa, this particular weekend that I visited him. And I remember going and spending the weekend with them and just realizing that something was off. Something was off. Dave just seemed, I didn't use this word then, but manic. Just manic. And so I noted that, I observed that, I didn't do anything about that. But then as the years would unfold, I learned more and more. At one point, my cousin Dave was eventually diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And he and his wife, they moved to Arizona to get more sunlight. And I remember going out there several times to visit. And I remember a couple times, the homes were spectacular. And he'd have a reason why they had to move and such and such. But he and his wife had 2 children, 1 year and 2 years after they were married, Lizzie and Danny, and they're great kids. And I enjoyed them, and Dave was an amazing father. But he had to do things to be healthy. And he wasn't doing them. And he'd be hospitalized periodically. And eventually, I learned that later, the reason they moved, he explained it, that it was a real estate opportunity, but they really went bankruptcy a couple of times. So, and I remember one time I was leaving Wrigley Field, and my cousin Dave's wife called me, and she said she was in the car with Danny, and they were driving around, in the area they lived in, Arizona, and they were driving around to different strip clubs, seeing if they could find his car there because he was missing. And that was not my cousin at all. So I wrote Dave a letter. And I affirmed him for all his great qualities, especially the amazing father he was. And he was an amazing father. But I also called him out on his behavior. And I told him I would be there for him and such. And I just encouraged him to do what he needed to do to be healthy. And I wrote him a letter because I thought he could sit with it. In the moment, on the phone, it's of the moment. I thought he could sit with this. Well, I didn't hear from him for a year. And then when I did hear from him, it was just a rant of profanity. He just laid into me. I never did talk to him again. It was a few years later, I got a call. I was on vacation with my family, and his wife and his children, she eventually divorced him, which she had to do. And they were calling to let me know that Dave had been discovered in Las Vegas, dead. And we really don't know the details. We just know the great sadness. And his daughter, Lizzie, was going to be walked down the aisle that Saturday by her brother. Of course, her father wasn't going to be there. They were estranged from their father. But I just share that with you because it's a very personal and real story for me. I don't have regrets for calling my cousin out on his behavior. That needed to be done. But I certainly regret every day that Dave didn't reach back. I didn't realize that there were those that loved him that would really walk with him and help him. Sometimes we are so proud and we either deny we need help or we just don't want the help because we can fix this on our own. I've got another friend, I could tell you that story, but I won't. And that one involved alcohol, alcohol abuse. And again, called out on behavior. He got all the help he needed in the world. His wife was extraordinary. But again, a divorce resulted in not a healthy situation. But brothers, we need each other. We need each other to help us be our best selves. And when we're not our best selves, we need each other then too, to help us get back on that path to being our best selves. There's a lot of men's fraternal organizations, right? I mean, there's the civic ones, the Rotary Club, the Lions. There's the religious ones, Fishers of Men. I mean, I'm speaking to one right now, the Knights of Columbus. Well, I'm in a men's fraternity. It's the Joliet Bourbon Club. And it's even, I don't even like bourbon. I don't. I bring craft beer with me. That I enjoy. And I bring that with me to the gatherings every other month. It was several dads from St. Ray's that initially formed this club some 5 years ago. And now there's over 75 men that belong to this club. And it's really wonderful, really wonderful. It's got a charity angle to it, and then it's good food and good drink. But I really enjoy the camaraderie and the fellowship of the guys. And this past July, we had a dinner in Mike's backyard, this Mike that I'm going to speak of, and 75 fillets on the grill, and then skewers of shrimp and asparagus, and it was an amazing meal. And Mike told me this story that night, and I just remembered it because I knew I was going to be giving this talk, and I remembered it. He related to me how he grew up in a very challenging part of Chicago. And it was just he and his sister. But Mike had 3 cousins that were like brothers to him. He didn't have a brother, but he had 3 cousins who were like brothers to him. And as I said, Mike has been very successful in life financially, as have 2 of his cousins. The 3rd cousin, however, spent 28 years in prison on weapons charges. Mike said they chose different friends. They chose different friends. And then he said this: you spend enough time in toilet water, you will eventually drink some. That's really the case, huh? The people we move with and choose to associate with have a significant impact on who we are, who we become. So I'm going to conclude here with an image from a film that had a really big impact on me from a number of years ago. How many of you saw the film The Straight Story? The Straight Story. It came out, I think, 22 years ago, 1999, The Straight Story. David Lynch, who's a very dark filmmaker, made this film for Disney 20 years ago. But it's not the typical Disney film. If kids were forced to watch this, they would just hate it. They would hate it. But this is such a beautiful film. It depicts the story of Alvin Straight. He was portrayed by Richard Farnsworth. Richard Farnsworth got an Oscar nomination for this role. Alvin Straight was a 73-year-old widower who learns that his estranged brother has suffered a stroke. And the 2 siblings haven't seen each other in 10 years. And we learn this is the case because of a fallout caused by selfishness and drinking. Well, Alvin decides to heal the breach. I mean, his brothers had a stroke. They've lost 10 years. So he's going to commit to heal the breach. He says, I want to sit with him and look up at the stars like we used to so long ago. And because of his failing eyesight, this is a true story, Alvin can no longer drive a car. And he won't take the bus. So his journey will involve his John Deere lawnmower over 300 miles from Lawrence, Iowa to Mount Zion, Wisconsin, where his brother lives. The stubbornness of what had been a sin has now been transformed into a commitment of repentance. And Alvin meets all kinds of interesting characters. I mean, he's an interesting character himself as he travels this 300-mile journey on his riding lawnmower. And one of the characters he meets, he encounters her because he's got a campfire going, and she shows up at the campfire. And she eventually feels comfortable enough to tell him her story, and it's that she's run away from home. And she tells him a bit about that. And he listens to the girl's story, and he shares wisdom that can only come from a man his age. He says to her, when my kids were real little, I used to play a game with them. I'd give them a stick, one for each of them. Then I'd say, you break that. And of course, they could. They could do it real easy. Then I'd say, tie them sticks in a bundle and try that. And of course, they couldn't. And then I'd say that bundle, that's family. Where one alone may be overcome, two together can resist. A 3-ply cord is not easily broken. We read that in Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Where one alone may be overcome, two together can resist. A 3-ply cord is not easily broken. Alvin Straight's words about his need for his brother powerfully express one of the divine intentions for family relationships and godly friendships. Alvin says, there's no one who knows your life better than a brother that's near your age. There's no one that knows your life better than a brother that's near your age. He knows who you are and what you are better than anyone on earth. A brother's a brother. So I thank you for being brothers for one another. And I just want to encourage you on your continued journey to support one another in championing one another as you see your brothers do well, and the kind of gentle correction or the outright correction that we each need to get back on course. A brother's a brother, and it's a very meaningful way to live out the gospel so that we may be the godly men that God intends us to be. Thank you. I appreciate that. I know you've had a gamut of speakers, but have you ever had a speaker that brought props? So I probably just raised the bar. So, yeah.
Father, you brought bourbon. That would